August 26, 1346. A gray sky hangs low over northern France, its light thin and uncertain, as though the sun itself does not wish to witness what is about to unfold. The field outside the village of Crécy is quiet, but not still. The earth trembles faintly beneath the weight of thousands of hooves, thousands of armored men, thousands of expectations. It smells of wet grass, of rain that fell too soon, and of iron that will soon be slick with blood. On one side of this muddy expanse, a glittering sea of French banners sways in the wind. The nobility of Europe is gathered here like a court in steel. They are princes, dukes, counts, kings, men raised from birth to believe themselves invincible. Their armor gleams like a mirror to the gray sky. Their horses snort clouds into the cold morning air. In their minds, this is not a battle but a foregone conclusion. Their victory is already being imagined in the songs of bards yet to sing. Across the slope, the contrast is almost cruel. A smaller line stands waiting. No gold threads. No silk standards. No polished steel. Rough faces beneath hoods. Mud-caked boots. Calloused hands gripping long bows carved from you. There are no songs here, no boasts. Only the quiet discipline of men who have spent their lives drawing a single piece of wood and string until it became an extension of their bones. They do not shine. They do not look noble. But before this day is done, they will reshape the world. These two forces face each other in the damp morning air, and if one were to judge by sight alone, the outcome would seem inevitable. 30,000 against 9,000. The most powerful cavalry in Europe against common men. Men who should have broken, should have run, should have died quietly. But history does not always obey what seems inevitable. By nightfall, the flower of French chivalry will be trampled into this same mud they now stand upon. 1,500 nobles will lie dead or dying. 11 princes will not return home. A king will be carried away bleeding, and the sacred banner of France will be abandoned in the mire. The cries of war horses will echo longer than the roar of lances. And over it all, the steady, relentless hiss of arrows will write the death sentence of an entire way of war. When the sun rises again, the age of the night will be gone, erased in a single afternoon by men who were never meant to matter. But how does a force of archers, outnumbered and underestimated, bring down 5 centuries of military power in a few short hours? How does an idea die on a muddy field, pierced not by swords but by wooden shafts and iron tips? If you love stories where history flips in a single moment, tap like. It tells us you want more tales like this from Echoes of Time. To understand how everything unraveled that day, we must step back into a world where power was forged in iron, where bloodlines and armor decided who lived like gods and who died forgotten in the mud. For 5 centuries, the knight was not just a soldier. He was a symbol. He was the moving wall of a kingdom's will. Beneath the weight of a steel shell, wrapped in layers of mail and plate, mounted on a warhorse that could crush a man's spine beneath its hooves, the knight was the apex of medieval warfare. His armor cost more than a village earned in years. His training began before he could even read. His birth, not his deeds, decided his right to rule the battlefield. When knights rode, they did not ride alone. They carried with them the weight of their bloodlines, their titles, their divine right. They believed that God himself sat in the saddle beside them. A fully armored cavalry charge was a weapon of terror, thousands of pounds of steel and horseflesh thundering forward, turning human bodies into broken fragments of bone and cloth. Infantry rarely stood their ground. Bows were nuisances, not threats. The knight was the kingmaker. The knight was death on horseback. Across Europe, the image of the knight shaped everything. The songs, the laws, the wars themselves. Armies were designed to serve the cavalry. Peasants fought and died to hold lines so their noble masters could claim glory. The knight's dominance was so absolute that it became invisible, an unquestioned truth. Just as the sun rises, the knight triumphs. Just as the poor toil, the noble rides. But beneath the splendor was a truth few acknowledged. This system was fragile. It relied on arrogance as much as it did on steel. It assumed that the world would never change. It could not imagine that a simple weapon in the hands of common men might shatter centuries of certainty. The spark that brought this illusion to the edge of ruin began not on the battlefield, but in the claims of kings. In England, a monarch laid claim to the French throne through his mother's blood, and in doing so, he challenged not only a crown but a legacy. The 100 Years' War was not just a conflict of nations. It was a collision of two ideas of power, one rooted in noble birth and armor, the other in calculation and strategy. In France, confidence was absolute. Philip VI commanded the greatest chivalric host in Europe. Princes, dukes, foreign kings, and mercenary companies gathered like a pageant of unstoppable might. Every knight believed this campaign would be a hunt, not a war. The enemy would be crushed beneath their hooves, as all enemies had been for generations. They were not marching toward a battle. They were marching toward what they believed would be the reaffirmation of their place at the top of the world. Where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments. History looks different from every corner of the world. While the French nobles polished their armor and counted their titles, another kind of army was taking shape across the channel. It did not gleam. It did not sing of glory. It grew in silence, along muddy fields, behind village chapels, in the hands of men who did not wear crowns. In England, the bow was not a pastime. It was law. On Sundays, after prayers, every able-bodied man was required to practice archery. It did not matter if he was a farmer, a criminal, or a fisherman. The yew-bow was a part of his body as much as the plow or the net. Fields became training grounds. Target butts were as common as church walls. From the age of childhood, their shoulders hardened, their fingers calloused, their backs bent to the weight of the draw. The English did not train archers in war camps. They raised them in villages. The longbow itself was a paradox. A single stave of yew, taller than the man who carried it, plain and almost crude in appearance. It was not gilded. It did not inspire songs. But in trained hands, it became a machine of quiet, merciless precision. With a draw weight often reaching 150 to 180 pounds, it could hurl a bodkin-tipped arrow far beyond the reach of a crossbow. At 250 yards, an English archer could find a man's chest. At closer range, he could drive that arrow through mail, through gaps in plate, through flesh and bone. And they did not shoot slowly. They fired with rhythm, with muscle memory burned into their bones from years of practice. 12 arrows a minute, one every 5 seconds. An entire rainstorm of iron and wood pouring down upon men who believed themselves invincible. It did not matter how thick the armor was when the storm never stopped falling. These men were not nobles. They had no heraldry, but what they carried was something far deadlier than a title. They carried a skill their enemies had dismissed as common, and a weapon that cost almost nothing compared to the fortune spent on a knight's armor and horse. In that simplicity lay its terror. The longbow did not respect birthright. It did not care for names. It answered only to strength, to patience, to discipline. The knight's power was visible, bright, and glorious. The archer's power was invisible until it struck. One was born into war, the other was forged for it. And on that field in northern France, it would not be gold that decided who lived, but wood. If this part surprises you, hit subscribe. Echoes of Time uncovers the small details that changed entire wars. The land that would host the death of chivalry did not look like a place where empires might bend. It was just a field, soft earth slick with the weight of recent rain, gentle slopes rising toward a ridge where the English had chosen to make their stand. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than a patch of countryside. But to those who knew how war breathes, the ground itself was already tilting the balance. Edward's men had arrived first. They had chosen the high ground not by chance, but by cold, deliberate calculation. Their camp overlooked the plain below, granting them sight, control, and a natural shield. Where the land dipped and pooled with water, they dug ditches. Where horses might charge, they hammered stakes at sharp angles, wooden teeth waiting for iron to fall upon them. Behind these lines, archers positioned themselves in a broad V-shape, their fields of fire overlapping like a net invisible to those who would soon walk into it. Then came the quiet preparations. Strings were waxed to resist the wet air. Arrows were set in the ground within arm's reach. Knights dismounted from their horses, shedding centuries of tradition in one silent act. To fight on foot was an insult to their heritage, but Edward had stripped the battle of honor and left only survival. He understood what the French did not. This was not a contest of noble blood. It was an execution waiting to be carried out. Below, the French army arrived like a storm without order. Tens of thousands pressed together on the muddy road, slowed by their own grandeur. Noble banners tangled in the wind. Horses, exhausted from a forced march, sank their hooves into the wet ground. The sun, hidden behind a thick gray sky, offered no warmth, no promise of a glorious charge. Philip VI attempted to impose control, but his commands scattered in the noise of trumpets and boasts. This was not an army that listened. This was an army of men drunk on certainty. They saw the smaller English host on the hill and mistook it for weakness. They did not see the traps dug beneath their feet, the sharpened stakes waiting in the soil, or the cold discipline behind those quiet archers. And then came the rain. A sudden, heavy downpour swept across the field, drumming against steel, turning earth to sludge. The English bent their bows, tucked their strings under helmets, and waited. The French did not. Their crossbowmen watched their cords sag with water, their weapons lose tension. Horses shifted uneasily, sinking deeper into the muck. In that moment, the storm became more than weather. It became a silent accomplice. It blurred the edges of banners, soaked the pride of knights, and began, drop by drop, to tip the scales of history. Do you think weather has changed the course of other wars too? Comment your thoughts. I'd love to read your take. The rain had barely begun to ease when the first men were pushed forward into the mire. They were the Genoese crossbowmen, hired blades from across the sea, famed for their skill with the heavy, crank-drawn weapons that had bloodied many battlefields. But on this day, they marched not to glory, but into the jaws of a trap they could not see. Their pavises, the great shields meant to protect them as they reloaded, were still far behind with the baggage train. Their strings, swollen and stretched by the storm, hung limp. In their hands, their weapons felt heavy, soft, and slow. The French knights behind them urged them forward with shouts and curses. The air was thick with impatience. The Genoese advanced up the slope, sinking deeper with every step into the wet earth, trying to form a line. At around 150 yards, they raised their crossbows and loosed their first volley. The sound was scattered, uneven. Most of the bolts fell short, thudding harmlessly into the mud well before they reached the English line. A ripple of uncertainty passed through their ranks. Then came the answer. From the ridge above, 5,000 longbows bent in perfect unison. There was no sound at first but the sharp creak of wood under strain. Then, as the first volley was released, the air cracked like thunder. A black storm of arrows arced high, blotting the light for a heartbeat before they fell. The hiss of their descent cut through the drizzle, a sound ancient and merciless. The front ranks of the Genoese were struck down before they could even crank a second shot. Arrows punched through leather, chain, flesh. Men staggered backward into those behind them, stumbling, screaming. The pace of the longbow fire was relentless, mechanical. Another volley followed before the first bodies hit the ground. Panic broke like a fever. The Genoese began to retreat, their line folding in on itself. But the knights behind them had no patience for retreat. To them, these mercenaries were nothing more than a tool that had failed. The Count of Alissa's shout cut through the chaos. "Kill this rabble that blocks our way." And so they did. French cavalry surged forward, trampling their own hired men beneath iron hooves, slashing through those who fled. Arrows continued to fall, indifferent to whose flesh they found. It was no longer an organized advance. It was a collapse in motion. This was the first fracture in the great chivalric host, and it was only the beginning. The battle had not yet truly begun, and already the blood of allies was pooling in the mud. If you can already sense the disaster unfolding, tap the like button. It helps echoes of time reach more history lovers like you. The Genoese were still collapsing when the second act began, not with strategy, but with fury. Behind them, Thousands of French knights had been waiting like hounds straining against the leash. They had watched peasants bring their advance to a halt, and their pride could not bear the insult. Shouts of command were swallowed by the noise of steel on steel as lines of armored horsemen surged forward into the mud. The charge should have been magnificent. A living wall of armored cavalry, lances leveled, banners streaming, a spectacle that had broken armies for centuries. But on that soaked and churned field, glory twisted into something slower, heavier, less certain. Horses struggled for footing, hooves sucked into the mud with every step. Men leaned forward in their saddles, trying to drive the mounts up the slope, only to find their momentum bleeding away with every yard. And then the arrows came. The archers did not rush. They moved like men who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Bows bent, strings snapped back, and the sky darkened again. Arrows found the faces of horses, the joints of armor, the throats left unguarded beneath visors. Great war horses screamed, flailing as iron-tipped shafts struck their eyes, their necks, their bellies. One horse going down sent 3 more behind it crashing into the ground, armor clanging against the stakes and the hidden pits dug into the soft earth. The knights tried to reorganize, but the second wave crashed into the first, tangled and blind. Horses slipped on bodies, on blood, on shattered wood. Riders were thrown, some impaled on their own broken lances, others dragged down by the weight of their armor in the mud they had mocked as beneath them. And still the archers fired. They did not wait for orders. Arrows were already stuck upright in the ground before them, ready to be snatched up, drawn, loosed. When quivers ran low, they moved forward between volleys, plucking shafts from the corpses of the fallen and sending them back into the storm. Each arrow carried no name, no mercy, no hesitation. The French advance, built on centuries of unquestioned supremacy, was unraveling with every heartbeat. What had once been the clean rhythm of a cavalry charge was now a cacophony of screams, collapsing horses, and steel scraping mud. Knights who had never known fear in battle suddenly found themselves pinned beneath their mounts, their visors fogging with their own breath, their cries drowned beneath the endless hiss of arrows. There was no single moment when the charge broke. It didn't shatter like glass. It rotted like wood, crumbling under invisible pressure. Men tried to press forward only to find themselves climbing over their dead. Commanders shouted orders that no one could hear, their words lost in the storm of panic. The proud cavalry of France had not yet been defeated by the enemy's blade. They were being consumed by something far colder, the slow, relentless efficiency of men who had prepared for this moment, and the quiet, patient malice of the ground beneath them. In the midst of the ruin, when the mud had become a grave and the air a storm of arrows, one figure rose from the chaos with the kind of resolve that only men of a dying age can possess. He was no ordinary knight. He was a King John of Bohemia. Age had already taken his sight, leaving him to walk through life in darkness. But blindness had not touched his pride. As the waves of cavalry shattered and fell back, and the French banners slumped into the blood-soaked earth, John listened. He heard the screaming of horses, the frantic shouts of nobles who had never learned to retreat, the terrible rhythm of arrows tearing the world apart. He understood what the others could not. This was no battle between equals. This was the end of the world he had been born to rule. But he refused to flee from it. He ordered his knights to tie their horses' reins to his, binding them together as one. He spoke no grand speech, made no plea to the heavens. His action was quiet, final. In an age built on the myth of noble invincibility, he would meet death the only way he knew, head-on, with a sword in his hand. The small knot of riders advanced through the wreckage of their own army. Arrows rained down, their horses stumbled, but still they pressed forward, a fading symbol of a code that no longer held power. John of Bohemia could not see the enemy line, could not witness the field devouring his world, but he felt the wind, the wet air, the tremble of the earth beneath his horse. And then they were gone, swallowed by the storm. When the English searched the field later, they found his body still tied to the men who had followed him. His sword was in his hand. His eyes, though blind, were open. It was not a victory. It was an act of defiance. a final gesture of a dying class, carved into the mud and blood of Crécy. The knight's age did not simply collapse under arrows, it went down swinging. John's charge became a whisper across centuries, the last proud heartbeat before silence. As the light dimmed and the field gave up its last defiant cries, the French army came apart completely. The proud host that had ridden toward the ridge with banners high and lances gleaming was now nothing but a broken mass of men and horses tangled in blood and mud. In the final desperate charge, Philip VI of France himself pressed forward, as if his presence could somehow reverse the tide. But the arrows did not care who wore a crown. One shaft struck him through the jaw, driving splinters of iron and bone into his mouth. His great warhorse crashed beneath him, dragging its wounded rider into the filth. His personal guard forced him from the field, their king choking on blood, his army already in ruins. Behind him, the sacred oriflamme, the battle banner of France, the symbol meant to guarantee victory, was abandoned in the mud. It lay trampled and torn like the idea it represented. All around, the flower of the French nobility lay scattered and still. Dukes, counts, princes, the armored core of a kingdom's power were now faceless corpses sinking into wet soil. The battlefield had become a grotesque harvest. Archers and footmen moved cautiously among the fallen, stripping armor and weapons from those who no longer needed them. Horses, maimed and screaming, thrashed in pools of blood. The air was heavy with the iron stink of it, thick and wet, clinging to every breath. And above, the crows came in black clouds. They feasted until they could no longer lift their wings, hopping from noble body to noble body, too swollen to fly. Word of the disaster traveled faster than the survivors. Entire families had lost their heirs. Great houses were extinguished in a single afternoon. For centuries, nobility had believed their blood alone was a shield. Now that illusion lay rotting on the same field as their flesh. Power in France shifted overnight, not by politics or treaties, but by arrows. What would you have done if you were in that muddy field? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. When the last echoes of the battle faded, something far greater than an army had been destroyed. The field of Crécy did not just swallow French knights. It buried an entire way of war. For 5 centuries, the knight had been the living emblem of power. Mounted, armored, untouchable. That illusion ended here, not with a rival knight's blade, but with the quiet, relentless work of peasants who had spent their lives bending bows. The longbow had stripped war of its pageantry. No oath of blood, no coat of arms, no ancestral title could stop a shaft from the sky. It was not birthright that decided victory now. It was skill, preparation, and calculation. The feudal order, built on the supremacy of mounted nobles, trembled beneath this new reality. If common men could slaughter princes, then power no longer belonged solely to those who claimed it by lineage. The ripples of Crécy did not end with the bodies in the mud. In the years that followed, rulers began to turn from the mounted knight to infantry, to archers, to mercenaries, to weapons that did not require a noble's blood to wield. And soon, another force would rise behind the longbow: gunpowder. Firearms would do to archers what archers had done to knights, pushing the world further into the hands of those who mastered tools, not titles. The field itself bore witness to this shift. Banners of noble houses lay face down in the mud, their colors dulled by rain. Among them, crows waddled, their bellies round and heavy from feasting, too swollen to fly. Those banners once represented centuries of power. Now they were nothing more than rags in the dirt. The age of the knight ended not with fanfare, but with silence, with feathers soaked in rain, with mud clinging to the names of the powerful. If this moment in history gripped you, subscribe to Echoes of Time. There are countless more moments where the world turned in a single day. Like this video, and tell us in the comments what event you want us to cover next.